Okay, so Immanuel Kant, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. I'm going to talk about some of the major ideas that he has here, the part from chapter 1 and then from chapter 2, and then a little bit about the larger political implications at the end. But Kant was really kind of a turning point in a lot of ways in modern philosophy. Especially in terms of epistemology, the theory of knowledge, how to make sense of scientific findings, how we know things or what we know, and how to relate our knowledge to the world around us. But he's also really important in ethics, maybe a little bit less on politics specifically, but you'll see the ideas that he has about what makes people moral actors, what the will is, how all these things work are kind of the high point in a lot of ways of the Enlightenment ideas, okay? So chapter 1, or the selections in your reader, passage from the common rational knowledge of morality to the philosophical. So he starts here a little bit like Socrates, with kind of common opinions, things that people sort of know or think that, or with what they kind of intuit, but don't maybe fully understand rationally, okay? So, as he puts it, it is impossible to imagine anything at all in the world, or even beyond it, that can be called good without qualification except a good will. So that's an extraordinary statement. But what is he saying here? Okay, nothing can be called good without qualification except a good will. You'll see in some of these places there's a clear, you can kind of see where he's taking off from Rousseau in some ways. So what does he mean by that? Why does he say that you can't imagine anything in the world that can be called good without qualification except a good will? Well, he makes the point that we've seen a couple of times. Other things, intellectual virtues, they're good, but they're not unqualifiedly good. They're not good without qualification. They can be used for bad purposes. Someone can be clever and use that to commit crimes or use that to deceive people. As he says, this goes for the gifts of nature, but also the kind of the moral virtues, courage, as we've talked about before in class. It might seem like a very long time ago now, but courage is a good thing, right? But a criminal can be courageous. Somebody can be courageous in the course of doing bad things. So even justice. Remember, Augustine talks about this. Justice, or Socrates kind of brings it out too. Justice is a form of cooperation. Justice in terms of discipline or cooperation in an unjust enterprise, obviously that's not a good without qualification. And even maybe justice in a kind of closed community that maybe has, even if it's not a completely imperial, violent, taking over other countries type of things, it might still be good, not without qualification. So Kant says all of these other things, the kind of gifts of nature, as he says, the things that we call character, is not by itself automatically good, because again, all of these things that might be good if they're used to good purposes are not automatically used to good purposes. Whereas a good will, the will to do good, the will to do what is moral, that can only be good for obvious reasons, okay? Likewise, he says the gifts of fortune, power, wealth, honor, health, all of these things, power obviously can be used for good or bad. It's not inherently good. Health, a healthy person can do good things, but a healthy person can do bad things as well. So none of these things, he says, is good without qualification. He says only a good will, only that desire to do well, to do something good, to do something morally good. So as he puts it, a good will is not good because of its effects or accomplishments, and not because of its adequacy to achieve any proposed end. It is good only by virtue of its willing. That is, it is good in itself. So again, it's not a question whether or not it achieves its objective. It's the fact that it wants to do something good, okay? So take a specific example, the will to cure cancer. You want to cure cancer because it's a good thing to do, obviously, okay? Just that will by itself makes the will good. As Kant puts it, it's not enough to just say, oh, I wish cancer went away. I wish there was no hunger. I wish there was no war. You have to actually will it and therefore work towards it. But Kant says the goodness or the badness of the will is not dependent on whether you succeed in curing cancer, okay? So first of all, the desire to do good is what is good. The goodwill, not necessarily the outcome, which you may not completely succeed in. And likewise, someone who achieves a good outcome, someone who say does cure cancer, does discover a cure for cancer, but they're motivated by a desire for fame or for wealth or something. Well, that the outcome is very good for people, but you wouldn't call their will good. The desire they have is to benefit themselves in some way. And Kant says you wouldn't call that morally good, okay? So again, he says you have to actually will it, you have to actually work for it, but it's the desire, it's the will to do good that is good, not the specific outcome, not whether or not you're successful. And again, by the same token, the fact that something has a morally good outcome doesn't automatically make the will that produced that action good, because you might have had other motives that are not morally good at all, okay? So he kind of says, the will is separate from the outcome. The will is good without qualification. The outcome, that's not enough. And we'll talk about some of the differences between other people that we've talked about in a little bit. But he goes on, and therefore he makes this very sharp, very complete distinction between what he calls duty and inclination. So he says, what is morality? Morality is about duty. It's not about inclination. It's not about your desires. It's about recognizing duty, recognizing the law, recognizing in general terms what should be done. In doing that, it's not about your inclinations. What does that mean? So he says, imagine someone who is very friendly and sympathetic. And everywhere that he goes, because he just through the grace of his personality, he makes people feel better. Kant says that isn't necessarily morally good, because this person, that's just kind of their natural instinct. That's just how they are. And they're not necessarily doing their duty. They're just kind of naturally a kind of pleasant, sympathetic person, and they make people feel better. That's good. That's a good outcome. But the thing, and certainly that doesn't make them a bad person, but the inclination, the fact that this is a reflection of their personality and what they want, or just their basic way of being, that doesn't make it good. Whereas he says, imagine now this same person is weighed down by their own problems, okay? And they're no longer quite so carefree, and they're no longer quite so easy to get along with, but they make an effort to do that because they think that that's their duty, to bring joy or to bring relief to other people. Then Kant says, at that point, it becomes a morally praiseworthy thing. Then we're talking about an actual moral thing, because this person now is doing what they take to be their duty. It's no longer a question of just spontaneously being kind of a charming or a pleasant person. You're making an effort to make other people feel better. And Kant says, then you're doing your duty. It's not inclination. It's not kind of spontaneous. It's not a matter of what feels pleasant or what feels natural to you. In the same way, he says, imagine somebody who is just not very, tends not to really be very sympathetic in a kind of natural, immediate way, maybe because they themselves are pretty stoic, and they don't really expect much encouragement or consolation when bad things happen, and they think everybody should be the same. And Kant says this wouldn't be the worst person at all, but imagine that they think, yeah, but I should, and so they make the effort therefore. So their inclination, their kind of automatic inclination, the way that they would act kind of totally left to themselves is one thing, but their duty, they recognize, I should try to make people feel better in these ways. And therefore Kant says the inclination, even you can imagine the person who is more carefree and more naturally sympathetic is probably going to do a better job of that, right? When they're just natural, when they're just acting that way on their own. The person who has to make an effort to do it, whether because they're upset about their own problems or because they're just not naturally that way, they're probably going to be less effective. But Kant says if you want to look at what is morally praiseworthy, it's not the person who is more pleasant and more naturally compassionate and comforting and does it more effectively. It's the person who does it because they recognize it as their duty, and therefore they make an effort, they will to do it, okay? So, and this is a really important point here, and this in many ways underlies, a lot of people in the modern world maybe haven't read Kant, but this kind of idea to some extent is very prevalent and underlies a lot of things, okay? I will read a quote here to illustrate it quickly. It is precisely in this that the worth of character begins to show, a moral worth and incomparably the highest, namely that a person does good not out of inclination but out of duty. The moral worth of an action done out of duty has its moral worth not in the objective to be reached by that action, but in the maxim in accordance with which the action is decided upon. It depends, therefore, not on actualizing the object of action, in other words, not on achieving its goal, but solely on the principle of volition in accordance with which the action was done, without any regard for objects of the faculty of desire. So again, desire, what do I want to do versus what is my duty, okay? Now this idea of the maxim, we'll come back to this in a minute, that's how he gets to this idea of the categorical imperative. But again, he says it's not necessarily the objective, it's, what is the maxim? What is the principle of my action? If I'm saying I should do this because it's morally right, versus I will do this because it's easy for me, or it comes natural, or it's pleasant, Kant says one is moral, one is not moral. It's not necessarily immoral or bad, but he says it's not moral even if it has lots of great outcomes. Okay, so again, a doctor who cares a lot about curing his or her patients because the doctor cares a lot about reputation, that patients are going to be healthy, right? I mean, hopefully, assuming the doctor is competent on top of that. But that's good, but the motive is not moral. It's not that the doctor cares about the health of her patients. It's that the doctor cares about her reputation and therefore wants to be thought of as a good, competent, successful doctor. Okay? It's a great outcome, but you wouldn't describe this as moral because the concern is with reputation, not with doing one's duty. Okay, so again, the idea of inclination and duty totally different for Kant. Again, take another example. One that we've used in class. Let's say I'm in the military and I'm supposed to stand night watch and I'm tired. My inclination is to sleep. My sense of duty is I have to do this. Okay. Let's stop and talk for a minute about how this contrasts with Aristotle and Aquinas. Okay. So if you take this kind of this scheme or this conceptual way of looking at things and you apply it to Aristotle on virtue, is virtue a duty or an inclination for Aristotle? Well, on the one hand, it's obviously both, right? He says we have this kind of natural desire to live in a certain way. He says virtue is a matter in part of happiness. And I won't go back over everything he says. Obviously, it's not that simple. You can be virtuous and still end up unhappy. But, why do we want to be virtuous? In part because we want to thrive as human beings. We want to be happy. So in part, it is about inclination, and yet it's not pure inclination, right? There's a certain sense of, well, certain things we should do, and to develop these things, it's not pure inclination, right? As Aristotle says, virtue requires practice. The virtue of courage requires practice facing fear and overcoming it. The virtue of moderation requires being in situations where you could be immoderate and practicing that virtue of moderation. The virtue of liberality requires having situations where you're handling money and being liberal rather than either stingy or profligate. Okay, so to take an example, let's say that it's your birthday, and let's say it's a friend's birthday, either one, and you think you want to throw a big party and invite a lot of people, and it'll be great, and it's something that really should be celebrated, but then you stop and you think, that's going to be expensive. And not that you can't afford it, just that you're not like you're down to your last dime or something. You're just like, I don't know if I'm going to spend the money on that, though. Well, Aristotle would say if you really think that this is worthwhile and you're sticking at spending money about it, you're not practicing the virtue of liberality. Okay? The idea of having the proper attitude towards money and being willing to spend it on the proper objects, Aristotle says, is a virtue. For Kant, you can see how, well, having a dinner with your friends and celebrating something, it might be good, but that's obviously going to be a matter of inclination the way that he understands it. Duty has very little to do with it. Now, if you hate crowds and you hate parties and it's your friend's birthday and you feel that you should throw them a party just to be kind, to celebrate their birthday, and you actually can't stand the idea, then maybe we're getting into what Kant would say is a matter of duty and morality. But for Aristotle, it doesn't have to be that far, right? There's a certain goodness. There's something clearly desirable about doing these things. There's something clearly desirable about being courageous, about being just, about all of these things. So this kind of stark opposition between duty and inclination doesn't really fit with what Aristotle says about these things. Obviously, inclinations like greed, the desire for physical pleasure, these things are not part of virtue for Aristotle, obviously. But it's not a simple matter of duty or morality versus inclination, okay? Likewise, remember what Thomas Aquinas said about natural law. There are certain goods for our nature as human beings that we necessarily pursue. We have an inclination towards things like learning the truth or living in society. So natural law, morality for Aquinas is certainly not a matter of inclination versus duty. It's in part properly achieving, again, kind of like Aristotle, kind of properly achieving that impulse, that potential that we have, and therefore we have a natural inclination towards these things. Now, it's not always following our inclinations, okay? Obviously, if you have an inclination to overeat or an inclination to avoid danger or an inclination to sleep all the time, those are inclinations that are not part of the, not in accord with reason, as Aquinas would say, not in accord with natural law. And likewise, there's an inclination, there's a good of self-preservation, but that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that you care about, right? So it's not like just any inclination is automatically good in the conception of natural law. But it's also not a matter that inclinations have nothing to do with morality. Inclinations, it's in part about recognizing the right ones, training them, focusing on them, ordering them correctly so that one like self-preservation doesn't overwhelm everything else, but also so that one like knowing the truth about God doesn't necessarily overwhelm everything else, because that may not be appropriate for everybody. So, in these cases, you can see what a contrast this is, and there are all kinds of other examples we could use, all kinds of other ways we could develop this idea, but you see how there's a real break here, okay? It's no longer about something kind of an inherent sense of morality, an inherent sense of the good that we're trying to pursue through morality. Instead, it's very much about duty, which we recognize in part through reason, but a kind of abstract, disembodied sense of reason as general principles versus inclination, what we may want to do. And again, Kant's not saying that when we follow inclination, it's always bad. It's just not moral, okay? So one last very kind of representative quote from this part of the readings. Duty is the necessity of an act done out of respect for the law. So again, it's not about inclination. It's not about what seems like it's going to be happy for you or happy for anyone else. It's done out of respect for the law. You recognize what the law is, and especially Kant will say the law that you can recognize using your own reason, okay, the categorical imperative, basically. And when you recognize that, so it's not just the laws and the speed limit is 55 miles an hour, it's what is the law in the sense of what is really rational in this situation? What should a free, rational agent do? When you recognize that and then you do it out of respect for that law in that sense, that's what really duty is. That's what morality is, according to Kant, okay? So then moving on, chapter 2, transition from popular moral philosophy to a metaphysics of morals. Basically, he kind of following on this idea that there's a sharp distinction and even kind of a somewhat an opposition between duty and inclination. He says all human beings desire happiness, right? Obviously, every rational creature, every human being wants to be happy. And so therefore he defines prudence as skill in the choice of the means to one's own greatest well-being, okay? There are lots of examples we could think of. You sit down to a big meal and you don't overeat because you don't want to be uncomfortable, right? That's an example of prudence for Kant. Choosing a good spouse, marrying somebody who will make you happy. That's an example of prudence, right? Making a good choice about your own happiness, investing wisely for retirement or for whatever. Those are examples of what Kant would call prudence. Remember, for Aristotle, prudence is more about being able to recognize what is the right thing to do in a given situation, how to practice the virtues in a particular situation. So again, it's a very different concept. But for Kant, prudence in this somewhat narrower sense just means figuring out what is good for you and being able to see that, figuring out what will make you happy, okay? So obviously he's going to say prudence has nothing to do with morality, okay? So he says there are two types of imperatives. When we go back to this idea of maxims or principles governing our actions, okay? He says there are two types of imperatives. One are hypothetical. And the hypothetical imperative basically means if you want to do something, you have to do this. So it could be something that you don't particularly want to do. I mean, if you want to take a long drive, you have to have a full tank of gas. You may not want to drive at all, but the point is, if you want to do this, you have to do it. But oftentimes it's if you want to be happy, do this, okay? If you want to be able to retire at this age, make good investments, okay? So they're hypothetical imperatives. There are if this, then that. Then there is the categorical imperative, okay? Hypothetical imperatives, like I say, it can just be, if you want to eat a sandwich, you have to have bread. I mean, things that are not necessarily about happiness necessarily, but many of the cases that he's talking about are if you want to be happy or if you want this end, you must do this, okay? And he says that's not quite morality. The categorical imperative, on the other hand, is universal, it's good in itself. This is what we're talking about when we talk about morality. As Kant puts it, if the action is thought of as good in itself, and therefore as necessary for a will which of itself conforms to reason as its principle, then the imperative is categorical. Okay, and he says it's really hard to identify that in practice. So he says, what is the categorical imperative? How would we figure it out? He says, well, there's no real individual action or decision you could really use because you never know in experience. In the world of things actually happening, who knows what someone's motive really is? So if you say you should never lie, that's immoral. And then there's a situation and it's difficult for you and you tell the truth. Did you do that because of your sense of duty, or did you do it because you thought, well, honesty is the best policy. I don't want to get the reputation as a liar because then people will stop believing me. Did you do it because of pride? Did you do it, this is embarrassing, but I'm proud to be the kind of person who tells the truth, even when it's difficult. So you never really know what the motive is. So individual things like that, anything that is specific might kind of be related to morality, but we can't call it a categorical imperative because you never know if it was really a matter of a hypothetical imperative. If I want to maintain my self-respect, I have to tell the truth here. If I want to have a good reputation, I have to tell the truth here. It's hard to know in practice what it was. So he says, there is therefore only one categorical imperative, and it is this. act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, okay? So there's one categorical imperative that is general enough, we can just state it in this way. Act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, occasionally people will object and say, well, that's saying if you're hungry and if you want to go for lunch and you go to this restaurant, you're saying everybody else should go there. Well, obviously that's not what he's saying. He's not saying specific decisions would be an instance of the categorical imperative. But what he would, some of his examples, do not make deceitful promises. Again, he says, it's hard to know in practice what's happening, but that would be an example, okay, never lie ever. Never lie when it's convenient. He says, that's an example of something that you would say could be a universal law. The motive, we don't have to get into, because the one categorical imperative is you should act in a way that you should will that the maxim, the idea, the principle according to which you're acting could become a universal law. So when I am in a situation where I'm tempted to lie and I tell the truth, it doesn't really matter what my motive is. I'm acting according to this categorical imperative, okay? Because I never lie, I can will that becomes a universal law. As he puts it a little bit later, now he gives some examples, you can kind of question all of them, we don't need to get into all of that. A little bit later he says, as he puts it, when we transgress a duty, he says what we're really willing, what we're really kind of thinking is not that the maxim governing our action here should become universal. Obviously we're not. If I lie in a given situation because I don't want to cause somebody asks me a question and I tell a white lie to protect their feelings. Now, in that case, you might say, well, you could, never lie unless it's to protect somebody's feelings. But let's just say that you say, no, you don't actually, or let's say that it's then a little bit more, I lie to, get something that I know somebody wouldn't give me otherwise. He says, what we're really saying is not that everybody should act that way, because all kinds of reasons. First of all, if everybody did act that way, that would do away with the idea of promises. Nobody would ever believe them. But also, it's just obvious that we're not saying everybody should act that way. What we're saying is, I want to make an exception in my case. The law that you should never lie, the principle, the categorical imperative that you should never lie, that should say the same. Everybody else should follow it. But for me in this one situation, I'm just going to make an exception. And Kant says that's not really worthy of us as rational creatures. We have reason. Reason operates in terms of general principles, in terms of universal truths. And so when we can recognize that, and yet in a given situation, we say, I want to make an exception for my case here. He says, that's not really worthy of us. And again, clearly we're not acting in a way that we actually want the principle of our actions to become a universal law. We don't want to change the universal laws of morality at all that most people would accept. We just want to say there should be an example, there should be an exception here in my case. Okay, so he says, again, not really worth our dignity. So what do we do? And basically this is coming to the end here. And he says, now I say a human being, and in general every rational being, does exist as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will as it pleases. In all his actions, whether they are directed to himself or to other rational beings, a human being must always be viewed at the same time as an end, okay? And so here we get the idea, as he puts it, rational nature exists as an end in itself. The practical imperative that comes from this, it will therefore act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in any other person, always at the same time as an end, never as a means. So then a lot of these examples that he gave earlier, don't commit suicide, don't lie, help others when you can, the way he tried to kind of give them, or maybe you could sit there, you could bait a lot of them, but when you start to look at it this way, he says, here's the key point, okay? Rational nature exists as an end in itself. Therefore, in terms of if you apply the categorical imperative, what does that mean? Always act in such a way that you treat humanity, which has this rational nature, whether in yourself or in other people, as an end in itself, never as a means. So obviously that means you're not going to lie to people to get things from them, because in that case, you're clearly treating them as a means to your ends, not as ends in themselves. You're not going to kill yourself because your life has become unpleasant, because then you're treating your own humanity as the means to the end of enjoyment, and therefore you end your life when it stops, when it becomes too difficult or whatever. When it comes to helping other people, you should help other people, you should develop your own talents. One of the examples he gives is someone who has certain talents, again, let's just say as a doctor. Let's say they could study and they could apply themselves and they could become a good doctor, but they're born into a fairly wealthy family and they're going to be fine. Why should they work so hard? Well, here it is. Humanity, including your rational nature, your humanity, which includes the ability to do these things, you should treat that as an end in itself, and therefore you should develop it. It's not just a means to kind of a kind of subhuman, sub-rational enjoyment. It should be an end in itself, okay? So then he gets in, he says the idea of a kingdom of ends. So when you come to the political application of this, what does that mean? He says, imagine a kingdom of ends. In other words, everybody is treated as an end in themselves. Nobody is treated as a means to someone else's ends, and certainly not by the law or by the governing structures or arrangements of society. So the goal, or the kind of at the political level, what this looks like is this idea of a kingdom of ends in which, again, each individual is treated as an end in themselves. Will people occasionally lie to each other, manipulate each other, use each other for whatever? Sure, of course, you're not going to completely do away with that. But he says the principle, the goal of the society should be this kingdom of ends in which every individual is treated as an end in themselves. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that they pursue their own ends, whatever those might be, right? Again, if you're a guy who inherits enough money and you just want to hang out and play video games, well, and somebody lets you, they're not treating you as an end in yourself. They're letting you not develop your humanity. So in fact, what they should do is urge you and push you as much as they can to develop your abilities. That's what it means to treat somebody as an end in themselves, not to let them pursue their own projects, to do what they want, to leave them alone, but to try to get them to actually develop what they are as a human being, okay? And their potential as a human being. This gets developed a little bit more in that other reading, which I'll talk about briefly on the Old Saul. That might work in theory, but not in practice. And I won't get into all the arguments he makes there, but basically, what does this mean on a kind of, again, at the political level in terms of society as a whole, okay? So remember, Locke talks about property, obviously, and Kant is basically a liberal, okay? So he kind of agrees with Locke in some ways, but there are some important differences that come out here, okay? Remember, Locke, when he talks about property, it's mainly about acquisition, production of new wealth and things. That's not really Kant's focus. It is not about the natural right to property. It's more, he says, property is an arrangement that all rational wills should agree to, or at least all the people, and therefore all the wills in that society should agree to. So, and now what does it mean to be a rational will? Like any other time, when you go to apply some of these ideas, there's going to be some debate, right? I mean, what will a reasonable, how much inequality, what kind of distribution of wealth might a rational will be comfortable with? Well, that you'd have to figure that out in the details of a given society. But the basic idea, it's not about personal rights. It's not about individual acquisition or creation of wealth. It's about basically there's a role for society and for the government to manage wealth and to maybe equalize it so that everybody in the society can again, not just consent in the sense of, it's fine, but actually say, yes, this is a good system, okay? So there's a fairly active role for the state maybe to manage this, but speech, on the other hand, should not be regulated according to Kant. And this is where you get kind of the full flowering or the purest development of a lot of Enlightenment ideas about free speech and the idea, again, this idea of humanity as a rational nature, and really developing and realizing that rational nature, okay? So Kant says, whereas property maybe should be regulated by the state in a good society, speech should not. Why not? First of all, because that's kind of paternalistic, okay? He talks about it here, he talks about it in other places, like a short essay he wrote called What is Enlightenment? First of all, the state, the government, princes, authorities of any kind should not try to tell people what to think. They shouldn't try to suppress speech because that's not their job. And again, when you talk about humanity having a rational nature, what that means is people have to understand for themselves what they believe and why. As he says elsewhere, enlightenment is about daring to think for yourself. So he says the state should never try to suppress ideas because people should be able to hear them and think what they want. And the state trying to control or to think for people or to tell them what to believe, that's paternalistic. That's kind of treating them, again, not as ends in themselves, not as rational beings that can figure out the truth and figure out their own beliefs, but as kind of children and as non-rational beings that have to be managed through deception or through hiding certain ideas from them. Also, on the one hand, that's one major reason why you should have free speech in a society, according to Kant. The other one is, look, when somebody takes property, when somebody fences off a plot of land and says, this is mine now, you can't come on here, and I'm going to use it to grow crops, and you're going to have to buy the crops from me if you want to eat, or I own all the properties in the town, or I own all the factories in the town. If you want to work at them, you're going to have to work at the wage that I set. That affects you directly. You can't walk on, when somebody fences off land and says, this is my land, you can't enter it. when somebody says an idea, they don't force you to believe it. Just hearing what somebody else thinks doesn't force you to believe that. You're still free to think what you want. So it's not as coercive. It doesn't affect other people as much. So, take the famous line from Jefferson, it does me no harm for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Somewhat similar, but not the same. Kant is not saying like Jefferson, let people say whatever. It doesn't hurt me. It doesn't cost me anything. He's kind of saying something more. Basically, first of all, yeah, if your neighbor tells you there are 20 gods or no God, it's not a matter that it doesn't cause you physical harm. It's that they can't force you to believe that. Just because you hear somebody saying something you've never heard before doesn't mean that you're somehow being compelled to believe that. And in fact, if that bothers you, Kant would say that person did you a great favor. If you've lived all your life just kind of blindly following what you've heard all your life, and when somebody comes along and says there is no God, or there are 20 gods, or there are whatever, and that just shakes you to your core, that means Kant says you weren't really human. You hadn't really developed yourself as a human being. So when that person, not only are they somehow forcing you to believe something just by saying it, but if they do upset you, if that is troubling to you, then they've done you a great favor. It's kind of like that, Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. And Kant says that's for everybody. That's for every human being who has this rational nature. So they engage you as a rational creature when they do that. And even if it is upsetting, you should come to kind of figure that out. Again, that's what governing, that's what thinking for yourself means. So for Kant, free speech is about more than just, well, it doesn't physically harm you. And it's even more about it can't really coerce you. It's about really developing your humanity. And that's really the justification for free speech, but really for a lot of these ideas of the Enlightenment, where again, they receive kind of their purest, their most ideal, their most kind of high-minded expression in Kant. It's no longer about acquisition. It's no longer about personal safety. It's no longer about comfort or prosperity. It's now about developing your rational nature and really being fully human.